Russian troops are pulling out of Syria. Is this mission accomplished for President Putin, or is Moscow tired of a never-ending war? I'm Imran Garda, and today's Newsmaker is Russia's withdrawal from the war in Syria. Last week, we debated why Russia was giving Chechens the green light to fight in Syria. Then, in an unexpected turn of events, President Vladimir Putin flew to Syria to announce his troops were coming home. While the Kremlin claimed victory, its critics pounced, pointing out that the conflict is far from over and the next Russian election is just around the corner. Could Putin's about-face be an attempt to guarantee his re-election? After all, what incumbent wouldn't prefer a victory parade over a quagmire? Well, consider this. Daesh has lost its strongholds. The group's leader is either dead or in hiding. And a staunch Russian ally by the name of Bashar al-Assad is still firmly holding on to power. It has us wondering, maybe Russia did get everything it's been fighting for. We'll debate that in a moment, but first here's Shoaib Hassan.
They changed the course of the conflict in Syria and the fate of the Assad regime. But the Russian military's intervention there now appears to be coming to an end.
Министру обороны, начальнику генерального штаба приказываю приступить к выводу российской группировки войск в пункты их постоянной дислокации. Родина ждет вас, друзья. В добрый путь.
Similar praise came from Bashar al-Assad. He and his regime appeared to be on the verge of collapse just before the Russians arrived in September 2015, just in time to stop Daesh's onslaught. At the time, Daesh controlled over half of 50% of the country and had regime forces on the run. Russian air power stopped their campaign in its tracks. To date, Kremlin says it's carried out 92,000 airstrikes, killing 58,000 terrorists. The air power has also been critical in breaking Daesh's grip in urban areas, particularly Aleppo. Now the Syrian regime controls over 55% of the country, while groups opposed to it control another 25%, as Daesh hangs on to a mere 3%. But it's come at great human cost, as ordinary Syrians continue to suffer the most. The Syrian Observatory for Human Rights says the airstrikes have also killed 10,000 civilians. That's a toll Assad seems at peace with.
How can you liberate the civilians in those areas from the terrorists? Is it better to leave them under their supervision, under their oppression, under their fate defined by those terrorists, by beheading, by killing, by everything, but not having state? Is that the role of the state, just to keep and watch? You have to liberate, and this is the price sometimes. But at the end, the people are liberated from the terrorists.
The campaign has also boosted Russian influence in the region to arguably its highest level since the fall of the Soviet Union, with leaders lining up for an audience at the Kremlin, all at the cost of America. The role of the United States in the Middle East has diminished since former President Barack Obama refused to take military action against Assad. Despite his use of chemical weapons on civilian areas, it seemed to embolden the regime to continue such tactics. Obama's stance infuriated close allies such as Saudi Arabia, Israel, and the UAE. The Trump administration has tried to turn that around with increased support to the YPG-backed SDF alliance. But that has sparked outrage from NATO partner Turkey, which says the group wants to carve out an independent Kurdish state. Meanwhile, Russian troops have now begun arriving back home. But Moscow says it will continue to maintain its airbase in Latakia province and its naval facility at Tartus, just in case Daesh returns. But is it actually positioning to become the region's new and permanent policeman? Shoaib Hassan, Newsmakers.
To discuss this, I'm joined from Moscow by former Russian diplomat Vyacheslav Matusov, and with me here in the studio is Sinan Hatahet. He's a senior associate fellow at a Shark Forum. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. Vyacheslav Matusov, let me begin with you, sir. So Putin has said mission accomplished. What exactly has he accomplished in Syria?
Well, accomplished the war against terroristic groups. Main troops were destroyed and disorganized, and so I think he means that the rest of job can be very easily made by Syrian Arab army. That's why the presence of Russian troops in this quantity that they have during the battle, main battle against terrorism, is not needed practically. And Russia is undergone the criticism in the West and in the East that it is an occupying country. So he shows absolutely clear that Russia is not occupying Syria. Russia is supporting Syrian people to withstand against terroristic attacks and to keep its territorial integrity, because it is the main task is solved, and other job like destroying different fragments of terroristic area in different places of Syria is not demand a Russian presence in such kind. So, but Russia stay in Syria in spite, and he told that if they repeat the attack on Syria in future, they will meet a great new attack that will destroy them.
Yes, I want to bring in Sinan because the Russians will maintain 2 military bases in northwestern Syria. So Sinan, do you agree with that? The Russia's achieved its objectives. It defended Assad and it fought what Matusov calls terrorist groups. So it's time to leave.
Well, as Mr. Putin was making the mission accomplished speech, the Russian air forces were still active in southern Aleppo and conducted over 70 air raids in the last 48 hours. Reality is that this speech is mostly for domestic reasons, is to prepare also the campaign for the next election, presidential election in Moscow. The war has maybe changing and adopting a new let's say, modus operandus. The ISIS is not longer in charge or controlling large areas in eastern Syria. However, it still has some residuals. Okay. They are in small groups, and they have different weapons, and their threats still exist.
Okay, so I want to talk about where the war is right now and what's happening in a few moments, but let me ask Vyacheslav Matusov about the point that you made, that this might just be for domestic purposes. There's an election coming up. He wants to show himself as a strong man, as a victorious man, just like George W. Bush when it came to Iraq. Mission accomplished. That's all he wants to do. It's for domestic purposes. What do you think, Ambassador Matusov?
I don't think that the comparison with Mr. Bush is correct, because Mr. Bush came to Iraq, destroyed the country, and after that they sent accomplished. It wasn't accomplished. After his interference to Iraq aggression, it was 1.5 million were destroyed, of Iraqis. But now, of course, in Syria, the situation is different absolutely, because the main forces of Islamic groups are destroyed, really. And some troops are fighting till now. Even today, some hours ago, I received an information from Damascus, where a neighborhood to Yarmouk camp, Palestinian camp, was captured by Daesh, by troops, by some military people. And the battle is going on not far from Damascus. Of course, this battle is continuing, but it is not strategically have such importance that demand a Russian active role in military operations.
Okay, so let me ask...
I think it finished with Russian presence.
Okay, so let me ask Sinan. there's a feeling from Moscow that Daesh would not have been defeated. Yes, they're still around, right? They're still around, but they're weakened. So let me rephrase. Daesh would not have been severely weakened as they are now without the Russian intervention.
And I agree with this, point of view. Exactly, the Russian intervention in Syria has a revival kind of impact on the regime. They have been able to conduct a large series of operations in eastern Syria, and this wasn't possible without the intervention of Russian air forces. However, they haven't intervened against ISIS only. They have also intervened against the moderate or the mainstream opposition as well. So I think that it is a bit too early to declare victory. There is still a lot of efforts to be put on the table in order to consolidate and to this, initial victory, and also to bring stability to the country. And I think this is exactly what Russia is main priority right now, is to bring stability at any price in Syria.
And if we have to take stock, Sinan, if we look at the Russian involvement from the moment they began supporting Assad, let me ask you, would the rebels have been able to defeat Assad and oust him if Russia didn't get involved in this war?
No, I don't think so. I think that rebels and the regime would have reached a stalemate. Of course, the opposition was in a much better situation than the currently is. However, the situation in Syria was stagnating, and now it is not anymore, at least in favor of the regime. That's not necessarily in favor of the country, however, because the reasons why the revolution and the uprising started are still there. The regime is still corrupt. The regime is still responsible for the death of hundreds of thousands of people, and not to speak of millions that have been pushed out of their habitat.
Yeah, so Vyacheslav Matusov, when we look at the Syrian war as it stands right now, yes, there are some terrible actors all over the place, and many groups have done unspeakable things. But according to the best available estimates, the Assad regime is still largely responsible for the highest death toll, proportionally, right? So more than 300,000 people have been killed. The vast majority of those deaths have come from the barrel bombs and the soldiers and the airstrikes and so on. Was it worth it? Or does it feel a little bittersweet for you as a Russian that your government supported Assad while he did? Yes, he was fighting. Amongst those he was fighting, there were some bad guys. But is it bittersweet for you that he did some unspeakable things during this war and you supported him? And you yourself did some unspeakable things in places like Aleppo.
I don't think that Russia acknowledged such kind of approach to Syrian events. Because Russian view on what happened in Syria during 7 years, that Syria was the subject of aggression from the militarized groups from all over the world. According to the previous figures, something about 50 till 100,000 of jihadists came to Syria to fight Syrian regime, and they were supported by the United States of America. And we don't consider that they appeared in Syria, from the air. On the contrary, it was military, politically, informationally enjoyed support of U.S. government. And because they were main goal to change governing system in Syria, to remove Bashar Assad as a president of Syria, they were obvious goals of American here. And they were using Daesh, Nusra, all other groups, military groups, they considered themselves
Let me ask you then,
Islamic to fulfill American goals.
It's good to understand that, and I do understand that the Russian perspective is the Americans were pushing these groups. The Americans themselves say they were not. But let me ask you, if 7 years on, it's still clear to you, you can honestly tell me that you feel there's no difference between Daesh, between Nusra, between the Free Syrian Army. and all the other groups? Can you honestly tell me that they're all the same?
Well, we differ. We differ. Free Syrian Army, first of all, because we don't consider it a terroristic organization. But Nusra and Daesh are registered in the United Nations as a terroristic groups. Okay, Nusra changed its name. It's
no, so you agree with the Americans?
That's it appeared, but it's not. Doesn't.
No, certainly. So you sound as if you agree with the Americans, because the Americans see Nusra or HTS or anything that came from Al Qaeda, and they see Daesh as terrorist groups, and they see the others as legitimate rebels. So, I mean, it's surprising to me here because it seems as if you agree with the American position here and not the official Russian position.
Well, I don't think about official Russian position because I look at facts. If Americans joined Kurdish military groups in Raqqa to move them to the Al-Bukamal, that to be soon than Syrian Arab army, that means that they agreed with Daesh groups. They opened the road them to come first before Syrian army. I think our opinion that it was, and I'm privately, personally, I believe in it. That America used these old people. Abu Bakr Baghdadi, he was in prison, American, between 2005 to 2010. And he came out of the prison, and after 2-3 months, arranged this Islamic
but they were probably,
State.
I mean, it's
the
possible.
Same Abdul Hakim
but there's another interpretation, Mr. Matousov. It's possible that they tortured the hell out of him in Abu Ghraib, and that's why he decided to become the leader of ISIS, rather than that they controlled him in prison. Isn't that more reasonable, that he was tortured in Abu Ghraib?
No, I don't think so, because being in Abu Ghraib, for example, famous pictures are known to all the world. It's very, very disastrous. And if anyone finds himself in this prison, he will accept any offer American government can suggest.
Okay, that's interesting. Okay, interesting to hear that
that's
from you.
why.
Okay, fair enough. Can I move on to Sinan? I just want to ask him about the Americans here. Over the past couple of years, have we seen the Americans effectively sidelined? So we're seeing the Russians saying, mission accomplished. It suggests that the war might be winding down on their terms. We've seen Astana with the Russians, the Iranians, the Turks, and so on, not having the Americans at the table. Is the American influence completely diminished at the moment in Syria?
No, I don't believe so. They do enjoy a lot of influence over the SDF forces in northeastern Syria. SDF is now in control of around 27% of the Syrian territory, and it's not any territory. It's a very strategic on the Iraqi borders, with most of the oil reservoirs in the country, as well as also the Euphrates Valley and the larger agricultural lands. So United States is just priorities have been shifted since the chemical attack in Eastern Ghouta, and what they have witnessed from the regime and the Russians. They have somehow turned a blind eye to the Russians and the regime afterwards, and they have concentrated on defeating ISIS. And I believe that Russia and the United States have been, I wouldn't say maybe in cahoots, but have been cooperating in Syria for the last 2 years. They have been fighting side to side against the ISIS. Of course, there are differences. Of course, they are maybe not agree on all issues, but SDF itself have recognized around Bukamal the cooperation with the Russian air forces, as well, of course, at the IC, the international coalitions.
Yeah, that's a good point. Strong American influence in the north, especially through the SDF. Ambassador Matousov, so when we look at Vladimir Putin, we see he was in Syria, then he goes to Egypt and he meets with Sisi, Abdel Fattah Sisi. What does that tell us? Stronger Russian influence in Egypt, stronger Russian influence in the region. What is Russia's Middle East policy?
My opinion, Russia has no intention to create any military presence in Middle East. The situation around Hmeimim base and Tartus base shows that Russia diminishing its military presence and doesn't like to broad it to Egypt, to Libya, to Sudan, or any other place. Because, my opinion, Russia plans to establish, to create regimes, local regimes, who will defend effectively by themselves.
I see.
That is their main goal of Russian policy in the Middle East. Not to be instead of Syria, not instead of Egypt, not instead of Libya, but to help Libyans, Egyptians, Syrians, Iraqis, and other nations to stabilize the situation, and stabilizing the situation in the Middle East. It is the main goal of Russian Federation.
Right. And
I
guess,
reject
yes,
any,
certainly.
even from Russian side, declarations that Russia is going on to interfere in Libyan internal affairs. No, I'm sure that is not.
Okay, and I guess everybody wants to stabilize the Middle East, but I guess stabilizing the Middle East means different things for different countries, whether it's the United States or Turkey or Iran or Russia. Interesting times indeed for Syria and the region. I have to move on, so this is where I thank you, Vyacheslav Matusov and Sinan Hatayat. Thank you very much for joining us on the Newsmakers.
Thank you.
Still ahead on the Newsmakers, are sanctions against North Korea hurting the country's most vulnerable people? And will the UK manage to secure the release of jailed British-Iranian woman Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe? We speak to her husband in a moment. Welcome back to the Newsmakers. The United Nations says sanctions targeting North Korea have the potential to block its food aid, which the organization calls a lifeline to millions of starving people. A decades-long famine has left many North Koreans without enough to eat. And as the country heads deeper into winter, temperatures are plunging. Relief officials warn that the international community may need to reassess how it's trying to stop Pyongyang's weapons program without affecting the poor. Vanessa Keneally reports.
A peaceful city at the centre of what's been described as the most tense and dangerous security situation in the world today. At a meeting on Sunday, the United Nations High Commissioner told its members that sanctions implemented on North Korea earlier this year may not be having the desired effect. And instead of punishing leader Kim Jong-un for firing test missiles over Japan and towards the US, they're punishing the people.
The humanitarian assistance provided by UN agencies and others is literally a lifeline for some 13 million acutely vulnerable individuals. I ask that members of this council conduct an assessment of the human rights impact of sanctions, and that conduct or that action be taken to minimize their adverse humanitarian consequences.
Both the US and Japan agree that North Koreans are suffering.
The Security Council reiterates its deep concern at the grave hardship that people in the DPRK are subject to.
But neither Washington nor Tokyo seem willing to ease their stance.
The systematic human rights violations and abuses of the North Korean government are more than the cause of its people's suffering. They are a means to a single end: keeping the Kim Jong-un regime in power.
Among the reasons the UN is so worried is because of Pyongyang's blatant ramping up of its arsenal. On Tuesday, North Korea's state broadcaster showed Kim Jong-un attending a conference on munitions, as well as congratulating those who worked on the latest intercontinental ballistic missile. The US and Asian officials now believe Pyongyang has the means to produce weapons capable of a biological attack. And that ongoing investment in armour has been taking food out of the mouths of North Koreans for years now. A famine in the 1990s is estimated to have killed 2.5 million people, while the World Food Programme says 70% of the current population do not know where their next meal will come from. Meanwhile, China seems to be preparing for thousands of refugees who may stream across its border in the coming weeks. In a leaked document seen by the New York Times, Beijing is preparing camps in 3 villages to help those fleeing. When asked on Monday, China's Foreign Ministry spokesman Liu Kan said he hadn't seen any such document, but also didn't deny it existed. So while the evidence seems to be mounting that North Korea is building up its weaponry, it's harder to tell what the closed state or its leader have in mind. Vanessa Keneally, The Newsmakers.
Okay, let's go to our panel in Washington, D.C. We're joined by Ambassador Joseph Detrani, a former U.S. envoy for the Six Nation talks with North Korea, and retired Professor Han Park, who's acted as an unofficial negotiator between the two countries, as well as Robert Manning, who was a policy advisor for the Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. Robert Manning, let me begin with you. Are sanctions counterproductive if the UN is saying that it might actually lead to people starving to death?
That's a complicated issue. It's not so simple. The main cause of starvation for the North Korean people is the North Korean regime. And I note that Kim Jong-un doesn't look like he's missed very many meals. If they have enough money to test dozens of missiles and develop nuclear weapons, they could certainly purchase the food to feed their people. They choose not to, number one. Number two, most of the UN programs do not allow, that North Koreans do not allow them to monitor the actual distribution of the food. In the past, we know that the North Korean military has taken some of this food and stockpiled it. So if you're going to provide humanitarian aid, you need to be able to have complete transparency so you know where it ends up. Mm-hmm. And we don't have that. But secondly, it's the elite in North Korea that really get hit by the sanctions. So that's their intention, and I believe that's the result.
Okay, so Professor Han Park, is it just the elite that are getting hit by the sanctions and that actually this is not going to lead to people starving to death?
Yeah, it will lead to starvation of the people, vast number of people. 3 things are very clear we have to realize. One, North Korea is already a nuclear state. So denuclearization is not a realistic goal anymore, maybe non-proliferation. 2, North Korean leadership will never collapse. The leadership is very solid. People may starve. Economic difficulties will never cause collapse of a system. Legitimacy crisis will cause collapse of system, and that regime, Kim Jong-un regime, is enjoying legitimacy from the support of the people immensely. And another thing very clear is there is no military option.
Right.
I don't think we can use military successfully, effectively.
Okay, so before we talk about nukes, I just want to ask Joseph Detrani, Mr. Ambassador, there's something interesting about what the ICC judge, Thomas Bergenthal, said recently. He said the North Korean camps are worse than the Nazi camps, essentially worse than Auschwitz. And we've had the International Bar Association War Crimes Committee come out with this report, and it shows it's horrendous, right? Kwan Liso, they show horrendous torture. People are starved to death. They're being fed to the dogs and so on. So if you have the international community looking at this, and it can be fairly solidly ascertained that this is going on in death camps in North Korea, people will be asking, well, how do you actually stop this if not through sanctions or maybe if not through war? Nukes aside, if they're starving people to death in gulags, how do you actually stop this?
Well, let me just say 2 things on this. First of all, the question on sanctions. Sanctions are biting, and sanctions are focusing on their nuclear and their missile programs and their other programs, and that's where the sanctions are. A lot of issues touch sanctions in other ways because, let's face it, China's not importing the coal, not doing the trade in the past. Kaesung, an industrial complex, has been closed, so fewer people are employed. But that's an issue for North Korea. As Mr. Manning said, the public distribution system is broken. And sanctions are affecting the leadership, and they're focused on the leadership. And I can tell you the NGOs that are doing humanitarian work, they get permission to go in there to do it. But let me mention on the gulags, when you mention that has always been a very key part of our discussions with North Korea. If we go back to 2005, September 2005, we had a joint statement. And in that joint statement was focusing on the nuclear programs. But it was lending itself then to ultimately a dialogue with the United States and North Korea with other countries like Japan, South Korea, to normalize relations. And we always put human rights on the top of the list, where there would have to be transparency into the programs, and there'd have to be progress and benchmarks for measuring it. So this has always been a very important issue for the United States. And I think as we normalize, as we move towards a more normal relationship with North Korea, a non-nuclear weapons North Korea, we could address that issue very, very clearly.
Yeah, it's interesting that we've had Rex Tillerson, the Secretary of State, saying we're ready to talk anytime, no preconditions. It's more diplomatic than the fire and fury and little rocket man words that came from the president. That's interesting. We'll have to wait and see where that takes us. Let me ask you, Robert Manning, the fundamental question about North Korea and nukes. There's a perception that North Korea is hell-bent on collective suicide, or it is at the very least prepared for collective suicide by launching a first strike on whether it's South Korea, whether it's Japan or the United States. Is that true? Or is North Korea maybe a more rational actor who just wants nukes for deterrent purposes?
Well, we don't know all of their intentions, but what you suggested, I believe the exact opposite is the truth, that every indication we've had for many, many years is that the Kim family dynasty highest priority is regime survival. And so I think they see nukes certainly as a deterrent from an American attack. And I think American officials ought to be thinking about that when they make these comments, which I think plays into their threat narrative. But the worry in the U.S. is that they have something in mind beyond deterrence, that if they get an ICBM, they perhaps would use it for coercive purposes to try to threaten a limited nuclear war to get the U.S. off the Korean Peninsula, or even threaten coercion to try to force unification on their terms with South Korea. That's the big fear.
Okay, Han Park, is North Korea a rational or irrational actor that will risk collective suicide for the sake of Juche?
No, North Korea is extremely rational people. They know what's good for them subjectively. They want to survive, not the political system as a whole, but the regime and the leadership itself. And there's no danger for the collapse of the regime anytime soon. Last 10, 12 years, we waited under the banner of strategic patience. Never worked. Strategic patience was designed to wait for the collapse of the system, and pressure, economic, political pressures has not produced any outcome. So I don't think we can expect North Korea's system to collapse or abandon nuclear ambition through this kind of punitive measures. So we've got to have more positive involvement with North Korea, engaging North Korea in such as non-proliferation, global, that is, non-proliferation. So once, North Korea is deeply confused. Face saving is so important. Name calling, like President Trump did a few weeks ago, is very counterproductive.
Right.
So we have to respect North Korea's subjective sense of dignity, involve them with what we are doing here, what is doable. Denuclearization of North Korea, we have to keep it up. It doesn't work anymore. North Korea is a nucleus. It has scientists, science, no material, everything. It has a market even. So there's no way.
So let me ask Joseph Detrani. Okay, good point. Let me ask Joseph Detrani. Should that be given up, denuclearization of North Korea? Just let them keep their nukes because they have them anyway.
Absolutely not. accepting North Korea as a nuclear weapon state would be a grave disaster. It would be a terrible mistake. We're looking at the potential for a nuclear proliferation in the region. North Korea with nuclear weapons, certainly South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, possibly other countries will seek their own nuclear weapons capabilities. In addition to the nuclear arms race that we would see, we have a question of proliferation. Some of these weapons, fissile material, possibly could be getting into the hands of bad actors. And this we have to prevent. And also, having these nuclear weapons, the chance of miscalculation or misunderstanding that precipitates something that eventually will use nuclear weapons, it would be a very grave disaster for the region and for the world. So accepting North Korea as a nuclear weapon state would be a terrible mistake. And that's why the goal is comprehensive, verifiable, irreversible denuclearization. But considering North Korea has security concerns, addressing those security concerns, going back to what we did in 2005 with the joint statement, where we were talking about a more normal relationship with North Korea, but a denuclearized North Korea. And we've done that not only in 2005, we did it in 1994 with the agreed framework and the Perry process, Secretary Perry in 1999. So we've had periods where North Korea was moving towards accepting the fact that they would not be a nuclear weapon state. They have nuclear weapons now. We know, we assess they have nuclear weapons, but the fact is we will not accept them as a nuclear weapon state.
Okay, so Han Park, don't you accept the premise that some nations might be a little bit more responsible with their nukes than Kim Jong-un and his family? That perhaps France or the UK or the United States are a little bit more responsible with their nuclear weapons than having it in Kim Jong-un's hands?
We should have a global perception, more accommodating. We cannot divide the world, the good guys, bad guys. We can't do that. If we're going to unable to live with the bad guys, we cannot live together at all. So it is so important. We have to give up the goal of denuclearization North Korea because we failed. Last 20 years we tried, we failed because we never wanted to denuclearize. Actually, we wanted to push the system to collapse. It never did. It will not collapse. Denuclearization, we missed the boat.
Okay.
We have to accept North Korea as a nuclear state, make a better...
Okay, so let's get Robert Manning in. You want to jump in?
Well, I don't agree with that. As our great American philosopher Yogi Berra said, it ain't over till it's over. And I think we've never tried the kind of comprehensive economic sanctions that are underway now. China has never cooperated to the degree it is. And I think that's the reason I watched Secretary Tillerson make an extraordinary effort yesterday in not only talking about his willingness to meet Kim Jong-un or anybody else with no preconditions, but also made the point that he understands North Korea has a big investment in these nuclear weapons, and he didn't expect them to give them up immediately. So he was looking at a process. And I hope the North Koreans were listening. And I think the other thing he said that was quite important was how the degree to which we're cooperating with China, including talking about possible contingencies in North in an instability scenario. This has never happened before. So I think it's quite important. The pressure's building, and we're in an uncharted territory in terms of pressure on North Korea. So let's see where this goes. And I think it's quite possible we may see talks in the near future.
Okay, so Joseph Detrani, is the answer to the riddle in the camps that the Chinese are allegedly building along the border, but there seems to be a lot of evidence that they do have those camps? Because before, and as somebody at the table, you would know, the Chinese answer was, hey, we can't be as hawkish as you want to be on North Korea. We have to live in this region. We have to deal with the flood of refugees that might cross the border if the regime collapses. And we're here, you're there across the Pacific. The fact that China might be building camps along the border to possibly accommodate refugees and so on, does that suggest that the Chinese have turned a little bit towards Washington on this issue?
No, look, China has been very aggressive in pursuing some of the UN Security Council resolutions that have been sanctioned North Korea on the coal and trade generally. Obviously, the crude oil is still going into North Korea. So China has been on the same page with the international community as it relates to North Korea and sanctions on North Korea. I mean, we're talking about 23 ballistic missile launches this year alone. We're talking about a nuclear test in September of what North Korea says was a hydrogen bomb. And we assess over 150 kiloton event and so forth. So there's been a significant amount of proliferation. So I think what China, I don't know that they're building these camps. Some of those reports are out there. But indeed, if they're preparing, because there's always that potential for instability from within. I disagree with my colleague on this. Regime change has not been the U.S. policy towards North Korea. And I don't think anyone is on that page. And I think President Trump, as soon as he came into office, said he would be willing to sit down with Kim Jong-un and talk about these issues. And as Mr. Manning said yesterday, our Secretary of State said, unconditional talks with North Korea are available. Come to the table and put everything on the table. We will talk about denuclearization. That is our goal down the road. North Korea can make their case for why they want to retain it and the security assurances they need. That needs to be negotiated. But if China is building camps like that, I wouldn't be overly surprised, but I don't know that they're doing that. Right. Because there's always the unknown aspect of what's going on in North Korea, because let's face it, internal dynamics in North Korea are very opaque to the outside world. We don't know the tension that Kim Jong-un is undergoing with his own elites. Mind you, this is a man who executed his uncle in a very horrific way. Yes. And what he did with his brother, Kim Jong-nam. So there's a dynamic in North Korea we're not aware of. Yes. China may be better aware, but China may be making preparations.
Yeah, and interesting to know that he might possibly have executed his uncle because he felt his uncle was getting too much of the pie when it came to business with China. Han Park, I want to give you the final word. I have to move on. Give me the final word. Tell me how the international community can get out of this mess with North Korea.
Together. We cannot rely on China. We should not trust China too much in this regard. China has its own national goals, keeping North Korea as a socialist ally next door with a strong military and economic and political climate. That is what Xi Jinping's China wants. We cannot expect China to play the game of the United Nations or certainly not the United States. If that's the case, then North Korea will not collapse. China will provide food aid, any emergent kind of needs in North Korea. So the world is much more complicated. We have to, and I think denuclearization of North Korea is, we missed the boat. Understood. We waited too long.
Understood.
So,
Understood.
Yes.
Okay, I'll let that be the final word. I've got to move on. But gentlemen, I learned a lot from all of you. I thank you very much for joining us. Joseph Detrani, Han Park, and Robert Manning. Thanks for joining us on the Newsmakers.
I can tell you that people here in the Foreign Office and across government have been working very hard over the last 19 months to secure the release of Nazanin, Zaghari-Ratcliffe, and indeed to solve some other very difficult consular cases in Iran. And we're going to continue to do that. And we will leave absolutely no stone unturned in our efforts to do that.
Pleased by the UK Foreign Secretary may be bearing fruit. There's new hope after his visit to Iran that British-Iranian citizen Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe will be freed after spending almost 2 years in a Tehran jail. Iran's Revolutionary Court convicted her of espionage for helping to stir up riots after elections in 2009. Reports suggest the Iranian government wants to bring her up on more charges, but the court says that's not true, and a scheduled hearing, potentially to extend her sentence, has been postponed. Well, my guest today is Nazanin's husband, Richard Ratcliffe. Richard, good to have you on the program. As the months have tumbled along and your wife's still been in the custody of the Iranians, Have you felt more and more that this might have been a terrible misunderstanding, or that they might be using her as a political hostage?
So it's been a long battle for a long time, and obviously I've gone through different phases. I think now I'm hopeful that we could have a solution, and hopefully a solution by Christmas. But yes, no, I've certainly felt that this was about more than us.
Have they demanded anything in return?
No, I mean, obviously, Nazanin got taken to court, it was a year ago, last September, got a 5-year sentence, as your report said. And then later on, she was brought with some new charges, and we've been bewildered by it. Who knows what's happening off stage? I know that it's been mystifying for us, and we've been battling very hard, and we're feeling the unfairness of it, obviously.
Yeah, and you say you're optimistic, and it's interesting to hear that, because there was a feeling across the board that Boris Johnson really hurt your chances as a husband, as the father of her daughter. Politically, legally, diplomatically, he messed up by his loose comments recently. What makes you so optimistic after his visit to Iran?
So that's right. The Foreign Secretary's comments were used to justify that second court case, and there was an awful lot of propaganda on Iranian media saying that Nazanin was a spy and that she was training journalists, and the Foreign Secretary revealed it. So it was very important for us that A, he correct that in Parliament, but that B, he then went to Iran to try and make amends and to speak up for her, which he did this weekend. And actually, since he's done that, we've had a series of things that have improved. So, as your report said, she was due to have a court case which got postponed and then got completely cancelled, the court said. She's been allowed to phone me suddenly every day. She's having an extra family visit today. And also, the Minister of Foreign Affairs in Iran says that they're going to be lobbying with the Iranian judiciary to see if a solution can be found on humanitarian grounds. So lots of really positive things happening, and if you ask me why I feel hopeful, well it's right there.
Is she being treated well?
We've had different phases. So at the beginning, she was kept in solitary confinement for 8 months. She went through a very terrible period, and she was on hunger strike, and she confessed to feeling suicidal. So clearly that was a very tough time. Since then, she's at times been given medical treatment, at times that's been withheld, at times she's had family visits, and at times that's been withheld. Right now, she's actually getting access to the doctors when she needs it mostly, and she's, as I say, being allowed to phone me every day and been allowed to see her daughter, a whole family, in fact, today. So things have improved recently. They weren't always good.
Yeah, and I know you've said categorically that she was not training any journalists. Most people, most countries would not consider that to be espionage, even if she was. So let me ask you, what gave them the impression that she was doing that and not just on a family holiday?
I mean, if I'm blunt, I think at that time there were a number of Iranian citizens, Iranian dual nationals, that'd be Iranian citizens who have a foreign passport, who between February and August of last year were picked up. And in some cases they were businessmen, in some cases they were people who had sort of connections to the outside world. In Nazanin's case, she works for a media charity. There were some academics, and a number of those are still sitting in prison. Now, we've been very, very public in our campaigning because I do think it's outrageous, and I've always said it. But I think clearly there was a wider politics that went on, and that wider politics has continued. She was unlucky, I think, is the short answer.
Do you fully and absolutely trust your government's diplomatic efforts in trying to get her home?
So I trust that they're doing their best at this point. I've been quite critical of the British government points as to whether I thought they were doing enough, certainly whether they were doing enough publicly. I think I've always been more critical of the Iranian authorities in public than the government has. The government has always been sort of softly and very private. And fine, but that hadn't worked after 20 months. I think, I mean, we're just an ordinary family, having the British Foreign Secretary go to Iran to raise other issues, but also to raise Nazanin's case. I mean, I can't ask for much more than that. So I feel at this moment they're doing everything they can.
And Richard, if members of the Iranian government are watching this interview, what's your message to them?
So my message has been for a long time, look, I think it would just be great if Nazanin could be home for Christmas. She's eligible for early release. She served a third of her sentence under Iranian law. Her lawyer has put in an application for early release, and she's very ill, and she's been assessed by the Iranian Health Commission to see whether she's fit enough to stay in prison. So hopefully that decision can be made within the next few days, and there's a chance that she could be home in time to spend Christmas with her family.
And how's the little one doing?
Yeah, so luckily, in some ways, Gabriella, she's only 3.5, so she was 1 3/4 when that happened. So, and of course, it's like all parents. You miss your children more than sometimes they seem to miss you. So she's with her grandparents. She's too little to understand all that's happening. She's excited about Father Christmas coming and drawing pictures all the time. And even she says she's praying to God that her mummy and daddy are released from prison.
Richard Ratcliffe, the husband of Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe, currently being held in Iran. I thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us. We wish you all the best. That's all for this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. You can check out more of our stories on YouTube, Facebook and Twitter. Remember to like, follow and subscribe. Next time, after a week of rage, Muslim leaders demand Jerusalem be recognized as Palestine's capital. Will it have any impact? Until then, thank you for watching. Bye-bye.